So thank you everyone for joining us for this CSW69 debrief webinar, specifically looking at interlinkages between SDGs 5 and 16. So we'll be really looking at the intersection of these goals on gender equality and peaceful, just, and inclusive societies to think about ways in which our communities of practice can collaborate, work together, and advance our advocacy priorities around both gender equality and building more peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. This session today has been co-organized by the Alliance for Peacebuilding, the Baha'i International Community, NGO CSW New York, and then ourselves, the TAP Network. We also head up the SDG16 Now campaign. My name is Elena Marmo. I am the head of advocacy and campaigns with the TAP Network, based here in New York, and I'm really eager to see so many familiar faces and names today on this call. One logistical note before we jump in. We do have translated captions available, so I will include instructions in the chat box here so that folks can enable them. I'll include instructions in English, Italian, or not Italian, sorry, English, French, and Spanish. So there is an icon at the bottom of your screen where you can select captions, and you can select the language that you might be speaking in and or the language that you would like your captions translated into. So while we do not have formal interpretation today, this is a close second, so hopefully makes things a bit more accessible for folks. So thank you all for joining us today. Really looking forward to this opportunity to have a discussion. We know the landscape right now globally, both politically speaking and as far as financing and funding, is incredibly tense and difficult. We're facing escalating conflict worldwide, backsliding in democracies, repression and civic space shrinking, but also shrinking funding for civil society actors. And it's really crucial now more than ever that our communities of practice come together and think collectively about ways that we can advance really crucial advocacy priorities around peace, justice, and inclusion, but also, with gender equality really at the center of it. So we're hoping that this conversation today will give us some food for thought, ways of thinking about ways of working together moving forward. And we have a wonderful slate of panelists today for our discussion. We have four panelists we'll hear from. First, we'll hear from Liliane Nkunzimana, EC member of the NGO CSW in New York and co-chair of the Peace and Gender Working Group, all with NGO CSW in New York, but Lily is also a UN representative at Baha'i International Community in her organizational capacity. We'll also hear from Diana Luta, a gender-responsive foreign policy expert at UN Women, Gabriela Keseberg-Davalos, steering committee member for the One for 8 Billion campaign, and we will also hear from Ishan Shah, Generation Equality Cross-Action Coalition Working Group at the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, which is ARROW for short. So we have a great list of speakers who will all really speak to different sort of intersections of gender equality and peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. So without further ado, we'll hear from our panelists in two questions. So I'll ask all of the panelists one question. We'll hear from everyone. We'll approach a second question, and then after this formal panel segment, we'll open the floor to everyone here. So as you are listening to our panelists, if you can drop questions in the chat, but we'll also have the opportunity for you to ask them questions later. And we do have a discussant queued up as well, Megan Corrado from the Alliance for Peacebuilding, to also kind of ask some questions and get us started. So with that, I'd love to turn to our panelists. So the first question really is quite simple. It's kind of what are your reflections on this year's CSW? Having engaged in this year's CSW, what are some of your takeaways or reflections, thoughts coming off of this CSW? And we'll start with Liliane Nkunzimana. Over to you, Lily.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you to TAP for bringing us all together to think about CSW. Although it was a month ago, I feel like many of us who were intensely involved in the commission are still really, our minds are still there, and it takes a minute to unwind from that process. It's 2 weeks of intense activity. So I'll just share a few reflections first on NGO CSW New York and the work that we do specifically around advocacy and the 12 distinct activities that NGO CSW does for the Commission. And I also like to share just a few things that I've heard other people saying about what they walked away from the Commission with, and perhaps just kind of two areas of future engagement opportunities that I saw kind of come out of the Commission. First, just for those who may not be familiar with NGO CSW, this is a grouping of organizations under the umbrella of Congo that helps civil society to engage in ECOSOC spaces. So NGO CSW specifically organizes civil society to engage in the Commission on the Status of Women. This was my 5th CSW, but NGO CSW has been doing this work for ever since 1972. So 53 years of working with civil society to engage in this space. And so that's a lot of experience and expertise on how to channel, really the thousands of people who descend upon New York during this time in March. So NGO CSW mainly works on advocacy. We organize the Civil Society Forum. We work on building a community of activists and individuals who are interested in achieving a more gender equal world. We also organize monthly meetings where people can come together, share updates, and really start thinking about the Commission, typically in the fall when the UN calendar starts. So just about the Civil Society Forum, recently, especially during the time of COVID, the forum became a way of facilitating hybrid participation, which has really facilitated the inputs of those individuals who are not able to come to New York. As we're seeing in this country, it's becoming increasingly difficult to come to New York. So this hybrid aspect of the forum has really opened up individuals to just kind of peek into the Commission, see what's happening. As I said, there are a number of ways that NGO CSW does this, whether it's having a platform where people can engage online, having civil society briefings during the Commission itself. They're thematically organized. Consultation day, the day before the Commission starts, so to really build up the energy for the Commission. But I'll just highlight two specific things. One are the parallel events that NGO CSW facilitates, so allowing those who are not familiar with the landscape in New York to organize activities during the Commission. So this year we saw more than 750 events organized by civil society, which I think, given the current climate that we're in, I think it really energized a lot of people to see that there's still this commitment, and there's still a number of people who are doing the work despite the discouraging political tide that we see. And I also just wanted to highlight the WOVA platform that was used this year. And I think a number of us are probably familiar with WOVA. We've used it in different spaces. And so NGO CSW saw 12,743 participants engaging with WOVA. So this really shows the power of civil society showing up at CSW. And I think just although those seem like what is the significance of those numbers? And hearing people reflect about the significance of this particular commission. It wasn't a regular commission, it was a review year. So that means rather than having an agreed conclusion to the commission, there was a political declaration that was released at the beginning of the commission. So the fact that we saw so many people show up and the advocacy of a civil society, this, I think, allowed for a strong political declaration. There are a number of individuals within the civil society who've been coming to CSW year in, year out, advocating for strong language. But the political declaration was significant this year, A, because it wasn't put to a vote. So member states release the political declaration without having to discuss it on the floor. And this was not a small thing because there were significant efforts to push for a vote. So I think having all the member states agreeing that, no, we like the Beijing Declaration for Action, we want to commit to the 12 areas of critical concern, that was really important. And of course, the advocacy of civil society was really important to make sure that there was no regression on Beijing, right? So that was really important. And it gave, I think, additional encouragement for people to continue to engage in this work. And a few other things that people have shared was the show of solidarity. Although the energy was a little bit subdued because it wasn't a year where agreed conclusions were being negotiated, a lot of people were encouraged by the numbers. I think UN Women shared that there were 13,000 people who picked up their badges. So that's a large number given given again the political climate within which we're engaging. Maybe just on connecting with concerns of like the TAP network itself and moving forward, I think I mean, there were many ways of course, we see that creating inclusive societies has to necessarily involve half of the world's population, right? If women are not actively engaging in decision making in the way that we think about society and shape society, then that means we still have a lot of work to do. But maybe just one particular evolution or event that I took away from CSW that I think that opens entry points for individuals working within the TAP network was a civil society briefing on a general recommendation that the Committee for CEDAW is working on, which is GR41. And this is going to be looking at stereotypes. So how do the stereotypes that we see within society, how do they impede the implementation of existing laws, regulations, customs, and practices that discriminate against women? So I think it'll be interesting to see how, as individuals who are thinking about SDG16 and how it connects to SDG5, how do we bring in the work of CEDAW, which is really obligates states to report on how they are ensuring that gender equality is ensured by the law within their countries. So I think there's many ways for us to think about how to work on that during HLPF when the SDGs are under review. But then, of course, in thinking about the upcoming priority theme for CSW next year, which is on access to justice, inclusive and equitable legal systems, eliminating discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, and addressing structural barriers. And of course, another entry point that opened up was the revitalization of CSW. One of the critiques of CSW is that we see friends and we build solidarity and we renew networks that we're a part of. But then what is the accountability of the member states on the agreed conclusions that come out every CSW? So there's this revitalization process, which is being co-facilitated by Ireland, and I recently heard actually Botswana is not going to be the other college, it's not going to be St. Kitts and Nevis. How do we make sure that CSW can be a way that not only we reinforce norms, like we have normative change, but we also have change that member states are held account to. So I know that I've spoken for a while. I'll stop now. I'm happy to answer any other questions later. Thank you, Elena.
Great. Thank you so much, Lillian. And wonderful kind of breadth in terms of what you've covered here, both some opportunities, but I think also the sentiment of holding the line and preventing regression and backsliding, particularly in the space of gender equality. And I think like solidarity is pretty crucial to that. So folks that maybe aren't necessarily seeing themselves as working on gender equality, but maybe you're part of the broader SDG16 space, this is an opportunity to really work in solidarity with our colleagues that work on gender. So now I'll turn it over to Diana Luta from UN Women to share some additional reflections. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thanks a lot, Lillian, for making my work easier because You have explained quite elaborately what CSW69 was all about. There are many things that were happening around this CSW. It was the observance of the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And within this context, UN Women, as the UN entity mandated to advance gender equality and rights of women and girls, we historically support member states to prepare, analyze their national reports on how they've been implementing the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action at the national level. And then we use that analysis to support the Secretary General to prepare a report that is then presented to member states and forms the basis for the political declaration that was adopted. So I will not focus too much on the process, but I'm happy to share more information in the chat where you can have a look at the CSW69 website, have access to some of those documents I have mentioned. From a personal point of view, and I agree with you, Lillian, that the energy this year was not, at the beginning of CSW, was not the usual high-spirited energy that many people come to New York with for CSW. But it was interesting for me to learn, just sit back and hear from members of feminist movements, both inside and outside government, who were part of the Beijing Declaration process in 1995. So to have that kind of intergenerational platform to discuss. And what stood out for me was what you just explained, Elena, on what the global context looks like right now. Many people who were there in 1995 during the adoption of Beijing say that they could argue that it was probably worse. And yet consensus was reached, and we have a document. The Platform for Action remains the most visionary roadmap for gender equality today. It still continues to shape global norms and standards for gender equality in all the work that we do. And to build on that was the fact that we had a political declaration adopted by consensus again. So reaffirming that although multilateralism is being challenged, there is still consensus that this is the way to resolve, to listen to issues related to global governance. So that really stood out for me. And then the second bit is related to the work that I do on gender responsive foreign policy at UN Women. While we were doing the analysis of the nearly 158 national reports that we received from member states, we realized that there's nearly 25% of those member states reporting that do acknowledge that it's important to integrate gender equality in different domains of foreign policy. So for us, that was a good indication that the global momentum that has been shaped by different actors on feminist foreign policies is actually affecting change at the national level in some way, shape, or form. And in line with this, in the SG's report, for the first time again, it's the first CSW SG report that includes language related to the importance of integrating gender equality in foreign policy. So this was a plus for me and a cause for celebration, for people who are working within this area of work. And then last but not least, we did have an interactive dialogue. So UN Women supported different experts who convened member states to look into the role of gender equality in foreign policy and how it can advance gender responsive institutions and women's participation. So this is already a natural interlinkage between SDG5 and SDG16 on the aspect of strengthening institutions of governance, making them more transparent, more participatory, and more inclusive. So I will stop there for now. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Diana, and some very concrete observations, both in terms of reasons to feel hope and also pride in the outcome and the work we've done together, but also some real concrete links too between both. our work on SDG16 and this concept of gender responsive foreign policy. I'm going to turn it over now to Gabriela Keseberg-Davalos from the 1 for 8 billion campaign to share some more reflections as well.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you so much for the question on the reflections. And just briefly first, an introduction of what the 1 for 8 billion campaign is. We are a global campaign, and I'm a steering committee member of that campaign that is working towards two goals. One is that the selection process of the next UN Secretary General in 2026 is more transparent, more fair, and more inclusive. And the second one, that it goes tied to a more transparent and inclusive selection process, is, of course, that we get, for the first time in 80 years of UN history, a feminist woman to be the Secretary General. So these are the two things that we are focusing on with our advocacy efforts. And among that is, of course, the work that we did around CSW. We were one of the organizations that was organizing various side events. In fact, we had 3, and they were very well attended by academia, UN officials, of course, civil society, and lots of other people from all over the world. And it's interesting because I agree that there was, in general, a very gloomy energy in New York and around CSW, but not at our events, because somehow there we could feel the real hope for a change in leadership and what it would actually mean to have a feminist woman at the top of the UN, not just symbolically, but also the message that this would actually send, right, within the multilateral system on a global level, and also for the rights of minorities, for gender equality, which is something that the UN advocates so much for, but we haven't seen it at the top yet. And we still, and there's lots of, there's a lack of woman leadership in multilateral spaces in general. It's very, very low. We had some great speakers who gave us the numbers on that, but who also shared experiences from similar campaigns, for example, at the Organization of American States, that just recently elected their newest Secretary General. They have a similar situation. In 70 years, they haven't had a woman. Once more, they have elected a man. So one of the lessons learned there is that we have to work much more on the national level, which is something that we are focusing on now with the campaign as well, and that I'm happy to share later on. But in any case, our sense was actually a very positive one. We came out very energized from CSW with a much stronger sense of purpose, which is obviously really great for a campaign, because you need to know that you're doing something right. And it feels like there's a growing momentum for a feminist woman to lead the UN and to make the changes that aren't happening. So we're working very closely with member states, of course, but with civil society, with a debriefing. We did a briefing for civil society in New York that Elena attended, where we also got some feedback from the New York perspective on what kind of advocacy we can do and so on. So we've been working now on the campaign for a year. We will obviously continue throughout the entire process that kicks off officially in September, but unofficially has already started. And CSW was a great space to get this feedback on what we're doing and to spread the word on what the campaign is working on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gabriela. And I think, yeah, we'll be excited to hear some more specifically on the ways to get involved with the 1 for 8 billion campaign in just a bit. So now I'll turn it over to Ishan Shah for some additional reflections. Over to you, Ishan.
Thanks so much, Alana, and great to be here in this space. My internet is a bit iffy at the moment, so if I do cut out, please let me know, and I'll turn my camera off. But great to be in the space. You've been great to reconnect with many of you post CSW. I won't sort of say or repeat what others have said. I just echo those reflections that have already been mentioned. But particularly when it comes to the political declaration, I mean, many of us who were following the negotiations, found it a very tough negotiation process. So the fact that we were able to have a political declaration by consensus, I think, is a success in itself. The political declaration held the line essentially. We didn't fall back on agreed language. We did make some steps forward. We welcome those references to ILO conventions, collective bargaining, freedom of association, gender responsive budgeting, all of these issues that were very contentious during the negotiation process and remained in the final text. And I'm grateful for the leadership of many member states who really held the line and made sure we weren't rolling back on language. But there were certain elements in terms of how conflicts and crises have escalated over the past 5 years since Beijing plus 20, where the political declaration has stood still and where it's not been able to adapt and respond to the challenges of present and respond to the urgency of these challenges too. Having said that, I think what's been profound is the youth mobilization around CSW and around the Beijing Plus 30 movement. Every year since 2022, so since CSW66, we've been developing the youth and adolescence recommendations, which are there to really mobilize young people around the thematic focus of CSW, but more importantly, to then feed in youth voices into the intergovernmental negotiations of the outcomes and equip youth delegates in particular and those who are engaging with their member states, with the language, with the demands of young people from across the world to really strengthen those negotiations and make sure that the text responds to the needs of young people. This year, we're very proud to say that we reached over 16,000 young people who have fed in and formulated those youth recommendations, which is an incredible number and the highest that we've ever managed to reach. And then throughout CSW here in New York, we had several events. We also had a virtual youth forum, as we always do, which led up to CSW. We had a global youth dialogue in which we discussed everything from CSW revitalization to the Beijing Plus 30 action agenda and more. And then throughout the week, we had great engagements with UN Women, with member states, and with all the stakeholders to really make sure that young people were engaged in Beijing Plus 30. And as Diana mentioned, I mean, it was so beautiful to see the intergenerational dialogue and to meet people like Mama Wangela and Patricia and even Didi Nyaradze, who were there at the 1995 conference to pass on that torch and to reignite that flame of Beijing within us as the youth movement to carry that forward and push forward progress together collectively. So yeah, there's a great sense of energy, a great sense of mobilization. And as we look to the future, I think this year is a very busy year for the UN system. There's a lot of key moments happening, including the Financing for Development Conference, the World Social Summit, the implementation of the Pact for the Future. And given the very tough landscape that we're having to navigate with regards to gender equality and this, a mobilization of anti-rights actors and anti-gender actors, really post CSW, it's been a time for us to have strategic conversations. How are we going to mobilize moving forward? And how do we make sure that the rights of women and girls are really centered across these other processes that are happening across the UN system this year and also in the years to come? And also then how do we link SDG5 to SDG16, which I think is the next question that we have to respond to. But really looking forward to the theme of CSW in a few years' time, which will be focused on humanitarian emergencies and how we can link that intersection more concretely. But I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Ishan, and really appreciate the lens of, when we're talking about peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, like, yes, we're talking about gender, but we are also talking about youth actors. There are so many incredible youth human rights defenders, youth peace builders that are part of the vibrant SDG16 community. And I think this is one area at the links of SDG5 and SDG16 that we can really strengthen the solidarity among our different communities of practice. So yes, you've very nicely also brought us to our second question. So thanks. My second question for our panelists today is, what opportunities in your area of work, so in the ways in which you are kind of working in this landscape, what are some opportunities that you see for SDG16 and SDG5 communities to work together to advance peaceful, just, and inclusive societies with gender equality at their center? So I'll come back to the top of our panel and pass it over to Lillian.
Hi, Elena. at the risk of repeating myself, maybe I'll just like re-emphasize the CSW revitalization process. I think that's an area where the expertise of folks working in SDG16 can really come in to talk about how the inclusion of, as you rightly mentioned, not just women, but also young people. There's like a really vibrant and lively community of young people engaging in SDG5, who I think can also benefit the work of SDG16. So how can we cross-pollinate these two areas and fit into the revitalization process? Although the deadline for submitting inputs to that process has passed, I think the co-facilitators, particularly Ireland, have been very open to hearing from civil society. I think at one event during CSW, the PO of Ireland even said, you know, if you see me in the halls of the UN, flag me down. You can come running after me and tell me what you think of that needs to be changed with when it comes to CSW. So I think this is an instance where there is a member state who's really open to hearing from civil society, and we should take advantage of that. The other one is the HLPF, which I also mentioned earlier. SDG5 is being reviewed this year. SDG16 was reviewed last year. So this is a way to carry like insights from one HLPF into another. So I think there are many organizations that are interested in again creating spaces where these two communities can learn from each other. And I think myself and a few others who are on this call will be really open to working with anybody who wants to kind of explore how we can connect New York and Geneva together, especially when it comes to this upcoming General Recommendation 41 and how our understanding of how stereotypes get in the way of us creating more just and inclusive society. So happy to work with people on that. But then maybe the last entry point that I'll mention are the upcoming priority themes of CSW. It's really handy that during review years, the priority themes for the next 4 years are shared with the civil society community. So we have time to kind of think about how we can participate in upcoming commissions. So next year it's very related to SDG16, access to justice. But then CSW71, the priority theme for that will be gender equality in the context of the 2030 agenda, because there will be an SDG summit in 2027. So I think that's an opportunity to, in many ways, defend the Agenda 2030. We see that increasingly many countries are standing back from this agenda. So I think, again, folks in this network, but also those working on SDG5 really can come together to show that having a global framework where we can think about the development of not just individual countries, but also like the global community is really important. As faulty as we might think the SDGs are, they're really helpful for us to have a conversation about how we're doing across so many different measures. So to kind of back away from that agenda does a huge disservice to so much of the work that has been done to advance all these critical areas. And lastly, the other priority theme I'll mention is a priority theme for 2029, which is going to be on humanitarian emergencies and advancing women's participation in leadership. Again, we can see the clear connections to SDG 16 there. So over the next 4 years, there's actually a number of ways where we can continue to make sure that these two communities are working together and reinforcing each other's work. Thank you so much, Elena.
Thank you, Lily, for a bunch of very concrete suggestions. And I think while maybe some of these milestones feel quite far away, I think now really is the time for us collectively to be thinking about, you know, these opportunities to work together. I think so often we show up to different high-level meetings with our events that we want to organize, and so now we have the opportunity of time to be really strategic and thoughtful about working together. So thanks for those recommendations. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much. And yes, I agree. Thanks again, Lillian, for making my work a little bit easier. Yes, I agree that the SDGs, in terms of multilateral work within the UN system, are the closest thing to global consensus that we have ever arrived at, that all UN member states have adopted. They've accepted that this is the framework within which they're going to operate in resolving, in discussing global issues up to 2030. But then the challenge is that 2030 is only 5 years away. And the accountability framework for these SDGs lies within the indicators. And it's these indicators that get domesticated by member states, and they voluntarily report on what they're doing, measures they've taken, the financing that they have allocated to implement and work towards the SDG targets, but also to highlight some of the challenges. Why are we seeing rising conflicts? Why are we seeing rising economic disparities globally, despite all the efforts that have gone into the SDGs as a framework? So those are questions that I think we need to accept are going to continue to linger for as long as we do not bring our synergies together across the different SDGs, communities of work. And I think that's why this discussion is super important. So for SDG5, I must admit that it has been acknowledged and it's recognized as an accelerator of all the SDGs. So it is cross-cutting, that has been accepted. But the actual work of integrating gender equality across the spectrum is still remains to be work in progress. So a few reflections from my end. From the work that I do, UN Women's work on gender-responsive foreign policy advances 3 key pillars. The first one is on evidence. So ensuring that ministries of foreign affairs and their affiliate institutions, meaning diplomatic training academies, their different departments and agencies, they make foreign policy decisions based on evidence, right? Then the second pillar is on women's increased representation in diplomacy. And this is in all tracks of diplomacy, whether it's in peace negotiation processes, whether it's in the intergovernmental negotiation processes, be that CSW, the different COPs that we have, etc. And the last pillar is on gender mainstreaming. So this is more focused on the institutions. So ensuring that gender equality is not just a preserve of the gender desk of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but rather an engine that can accelerate progress across different areas that are related to foreign policy, including migration, trade, defense, and many other areas that often are thought to be gender neutral when it comes to international relations. So looking at these 3 pillars, I believe there's a very strong intersection between what SDG5, the accountability framework for SDG5 has, so meaning the targets and indicators that actually track women's representation in public life across all levels and in private and public institutions, but also linking that to the need of strengthening existing or developing new institutions within governments that are inclusive, that are participatory, and that are transparent. So meaning women in all their diversity are included in the decision-making processes of these institutions. So that's one way. And the second way is advocacy. I don't think advocacy will ever grow old. And in these challenging times of limited financing, we know that traveling is an issue. And sometimes when you're not in the room, your issues are just not represented, or they're not articulated as well as you would have if you were in the room. So finding ways of working together, collaborating across different coalitions and existing multi-stakeholder networks to ensure that the key messages are pushed across these 2 different accountability frameworks. And then third is going back to the reporting. So if governments do not report on the implementation of SDG targets, then we have no way of tracking whether the SDG framework is useful for global governance, right? And that's where there's a very, very big challenge and possibly an opportunity for different stakeholders, but particularly civil society, to work more with governments at the national level when it comes to domestication, collecting and analyzing the implementation of the SDG indicators. As of April this year, there are about 60 indicators within the SDG frameworks that are still classified as tier 2, meaning the methodology of collecting that data is internationally agreed upon, but the data is lacking. And many times this is because of either lack of funding or lack of technical capacity, or simply lack of prioritization of reporting by some member states. So that's an area where I think at the, with only 5 years to go to 2030, it's an area that we could possibly build synergies so that by the time we get to 2020, we know to 2030, excuse me, we know that this is the outlook of how far the SDGs accountability framework has brought us. These are the gaps, and this is how we can improve it together. I'm going to stop that for now and pass it back to you, Elena. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I think this emphasis on accountability frameworks is something we're hearing across some of the panelists. Lily mentioning CEDAW earlier as a potential accountability framework we can use in our advocacy, but I think also thinking about the SDGs and the voluntary national review process and reporting on SDGs is another hook that maybe we don't see as obviously connected, but is quite foundational for building that evidence base to both identify the need, but then also to identify, the tangible progress that some of these progress on some of these SDGs can have for our society. So thank you so much. Also, maybe one link too, and there's a comment in the chat as well about financing, but thinking about accountability frameworks is one piece, but then also financing frameworks is another piece. We have the Financing for Development conference coming up later this June into July. And so, if one of our other panelists might be able to speak to that too, that could be really interesting as well. But I'll pass it now over to Gabriela. Over to you.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, no, definitely at the campaign, we also see a strong link between these two crucial SDGs, and we are working, part of our focus is on the revitalization of the General Assembly. So we're working closely also with the co-facilitators for this and making recommendations, working on language also for that resolution that is going to come out, I think around July, around HLPF. And we're happy also to collaborate on any side events or something that might come up during that time. And the link, of course, is, the more just and inclusive that we have our institutions and the fairer there are, the more chances there are also for women to go through these selection processes for leadership positions. And we are actually asking the General Assembly, the member states, to nominate only women. Most likely it's not going to happen, but we think there's a very high chance for this. We're also telling them to reclaim their power in the selection process and to not let it only to the 15 members of the Security Council, who usually put one name forward and then the General Assembly gets to say yes or no to that, but rather to ask now for a real selection of candidates so that the General Assembly has a real choice in selecting the next UN Secretary General. And I had briefly mentioned before the other way that we are working on this, where there's a good chance for the communities to come together, the ones that work on SDG5 on SDG16 is on the national level. So a big part of my job is actually to recruit organizations that want to work for us on the doing advocacy on the national level, working with their governments, working with civil society coalitions, etc., to bring forward the topics of the campaign, be it directly with government officials, be it through a campaign on the national level or be it through media, etc. And just to give a little bit of sense of the criteria that we have been working on so far, is that we have a wonderful tracking map that I will share with you in the chat box as well, that shows where each UN member state stands right now on the position of a woman SG. So there are around 90 countries that either very strongly or strongly support a female candidate, but there's a bunch of them that still are undecided and very few that are against it. And we're obviously trying to move the needle, especially with those that are still undecided. So a very strong criteria for selecting countries and organizations that we work on the national level is to see if they're in one of these countries that is still undecided. And to help us with that, we're also working with, for example, Pakistan, that is on the Security Council throughout the selection process. So that is really important to us to have that influence there. And it's been really interesting to work with them because the context in each country is very different. We're giving them ownership on how to do it. Sometimes, they think it's better to do silent advocacy. Sometimes they can be louder. Women's issues are under attack pretty much all over the world right now, in higher or lower degrees in each country. But that obviously makes a difference. So sometimes we have to focus more on the part of the General Assembly, but other times where we think it's okay to go right into the topic of the woman SG, then we do that too. So it would be, of course, very interesting for me to see if members from the TAP network are interested in working with us. They can reach out to me. I'll leave my contact in the chat box as well. But there's definitely a lot of space for collaboration to cross-pollinate these two SDGs and to make them stronger, given that they're both actually under attack worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. And yes, very eager also to support any of our members that are interested in getting, more involved if there is need for kind of logistical support maybe, and and we have a bunch of different really helpful advocacy tools and other kind of toolkits and things that might also support your work reaching out to your government at national level too. So happy to kind of link forces in that way. I'll turn it over now to Ishan for our final comments. Over to you, Ishan.
Thanks so much, Alana. In terms of how do we link SDG5 to SDG16, I think there is a plethora of opportunities to really do that. I think it's really important that we, as Diana mentioned, that we really come together now in an immediate sense to strategize on how we do so. I mean, we have the FFD, Financing for Development Conference happening. There are conversations happening on militarization and military expenditure in that process. We have the review of the peace building architecture, 25 years of the WPS agenda, 10 years of the YPS agenda. We have next year's CSW theme, which is on access to justice. In 2028, it's going to be on access to, or it's going to be on humanitarian emergencies. So there's a lot happening in which that we need to bridge between SDG5 and SDG16 and make sure that, both are placed at the center of each other, really. So I think that's really important for us to remember there. And even in terms of CSW revitalization, I mean, is there possibility to even talk about how do we strengthen the relationship between CSW and other UN fora that discuss peace and security? How do we bridge those divides? How do we make sure that, at CSW, member states aren't saying that we can't talk about peace and security here because that's for another process? Or in the peace and security realm, how do we make sure that, member states aren't saying we can't talk about gender here because that's for CSW? So really, how do we bridge these institutional silos? I think that's something that's important for us to strategize on concretely. And I saw there's a question in the chat, if you don't mind me responding to that on FFD in particular. But I mean that there is huge mobilization from the civil society mechanism around FFD. The UN Youth Office as well is doing some work on mobilizing young people. And there are several feminist constituencies, including Pan International, Restless Development, Walk the Talk, the Young Feminist Caucus, and several others that are really mobilizing around how do we ensure that there's a feminist lens, and within that feminist lens, how do we make sure that we're redirecting military expenditure to essential public services as well, among other things like debt cancellation, tax justice, etc. But I think really the main message I want to take away from this is how do we continue this conversation beyond this debriefing to more of a strategic conversation. I hope that we can all work together collectively on this as we move forward. There's a lot of processes to follow, but there's a lot of strategizing to be done on how do we really bridge this. So thank you, Alana, for convening this space for now, and I hope that this conversation continues moving forward.
Thank you, Sean. And like, wow, you packed so much into into that short response. But I think, yeah, there are a handful of pieces too that we haven't necessarily explored just yet in our conversation. The women, peace and security, youth, peace and security, peace building architecture review piece. I think also this question of, and I think this is a conversation that maybe we've had already, but you know, the challenge in bringing those kinds of issues into the scope of CSW and bridging the gap between peace building, conflict prevention, and sustainable development. And I think there are some opportunities even in the context of, you know, financing to have some of those conversations too. But yeah, I think also this question of maybe, you know, foreign policy issues that maybe don't seem like they are gender specific or gender focused, like Diana mentioned earlier around tax justice, justice, trade, for example, right? Like I think there's a lot there too that are absolutely feminist issues, and they're also issues of governance that are related to transparency and accountability and participation, which are at the core of SDG16 too. Yeah, go ahead, Ashana.
Sorry to come in again and
No.
disrupt the flow, but just wanted to say that in September, just before UNGA, we'll have the Beijing Plus 30 Action Agenda mobilization, where UN Women is encouraging stakeholders to make commitments around the Beijing Plus 30 Action Agenda. So I think there's also scope for us to mobilize various stakeholders to make commitments that bridge SDG5 and SDG16 around that. And then also in Beijing in October, I believe China will be holding a high-level event on or to commemorate 30 years of the Beijing Declaration, and it's expected to be at the highest political level. So again, how do we make sure that we're working with UN Women, with member states and other stakeholders to make sure that those conversations that are happening at the high-level meeting in Beijing are also bridging SDG16 and SDG5? So just two other potential avenues for strengthening that intersection.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Great. Well, at this point now we've heard from all of our panelists. I do want to say a big thank you to all of you for your expertise and your time, your thoughtfulness in sharing your reflections in this maybe somewhat kind of specific focus of the intersection of gender equality and peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. But now we'll turn to a more interactive segment of this meeting. So we have some questions that I've been kind of noting in the chat, some that we've actually already answered so far, which is great. But maybe as folks drop questions in the chat, I'll turn it over to my colleague Megan Corrado from the Alliance for Peacebuilding, since I know we haven't necessarily spoken too much about the women, peace and security, youth, peace and security, those sorts of pieces of this conversation. So over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks so much to all of our speakers for the excellent conversation. Really appreciate everyone here and the great questions and discussion in the chat as well. So I'm Megan Corrado, I'm the Acting Deputy Executive Director with AFP. We're a membership-based organization. We have over 235 members working all over the world to prevent conflict and build peace, which is a challenging order these days. So I'm based down in Washington, but did have the opportunity to go up to New York for CSW. And just a quick point on sort of the last question, the last round of questions on the interlinkages. So along with TAP, Pathfinder, CSPPS, a number of other fabulous partners, we hosted a roundtable on the sidelines of CSW about just this. You know, how do we, really interlink and leverage SDG5 and SDG16 together? There's so many challenges that each sort of space is facing, and what are some of the lessons we can learn and share, cross-pollinate across these sectors, because we're never going to achieve peace, justice, and inclusion if we don't have gender equality and women involved, and centering the WPS agenda in that work as well. And I think There was a lot of excitement about, sharing messaging. Peace building is hard to explain if you're not in the space all the time. So how do we make it more accessible to everybody? Same thing with women, peace, and security. We can get very wonky. So how do we, bring it down to a practical level? Because everybody can be a peace builder. Everyone is a peace builder in their everyday lives. So I was really appreciative of that conversation, and I think there's a lot of opportunity and certainly a lot of work for us to do to do this integration, because that's the only way either one of these SDGs are going to succeed. Just a couple quick reflections. So, I felt like women, peace, and security was not adequately represented during the formal agenda of CSW. This is the 25th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which sort of created the foundation of the WPS agenda. We've had, 9, 10 other resolutions since then. Here we're on 25th anniversary year, and we're not where we need to be. There's never been gender parity in a peace negotiation. There isn't 50-50 representation in any government. So how do we emphasize and use this moment? So I did think it was a bit of a missed opportunity at CSW. Of course, in October, there'll be a whole month dedicated to WPS, and so that's a big moment for us. But I did think civil society did a great job highlighting this. There were a number of fantastic events. I attended a few. AFP, along with Women for Women International, also sponsored a few. One in particular was on Sudan. We had 3 incredible Sudanese women present in person and talk about their experience, what's happening, the conflict-related sexual violence, some WPS efforts that have been happening, but on the sidelines. And we know when that happens and women are not actually in the room, but down the road or in a different room, that's not really true WPS in action. And just a couple concerns that were touched on a bit here that I share. We talked about how great it is to do hybrid, events and things like that. I think that's going to be, we need to increasingly rely upon that, because, I know our members and colleagues from around the world are very nervous about coming to the United States right now, if they can even get a visa. So you have the practical challenges, and then, real fear surrounding coming to the US. And there's just something missed when you don't have those local voices in the actual room. That Sudan panel we had was, powerful beyond belief, because they were able to speak, their truth and have their space and their moment. There was myriad other, country and regional specific events that, same case. So how do we deal with that reality moving forward to make sure we're giving the local voices an adequate platform? I think one thing I was a little surprised about, and maybe it's because I'm living it every day down here in DC, but I didn't feel like there was enough urgency around the funding freeze and review happening in the US. The US pays a lot of money into the UN, as despite the rhetoric, time after time, various administrations have still contributed quite a lot of money to keep the UN functioning. And we know it's always in a liquidity crisis and things like that, but it's about to get a lot worse. And our members, Alliance Peace Building, many were funded by USAID, many State Department, folks are shuttering their doors, or, doing massive cuts to staff and programming. That's going to have real implications. And so I think it's in the UN space, we really need to be thinking about what are the implications, because this isn't over. This is just a few months, we're at 100 days of the Trump administration. So for the next 4 years, I think we can expect some serious challenges from the US. We've already seen proposals for the FY26 budget, and it zeroes out contributions to international organizations, except for a little bit in peacekeeping. So something for us to really explore. And, how do we, it's not just US either, though, UK, Swedes, Germans, other big donors are pivoting away from development assistance in general, focusing more on military spending. So how do we address that moving forward? And then last but certainly not least, how do we start preparing for next year, in that the US will be on the commission? I'm sure many of you saw the sort of separate statements they put out, their conception of gender, which is sex and not gender. I think it's not just gender, but we're going to face challenges related to climate change. And we know the compounding impacts and the disproportionate impacts climate change has on women and girls. So I think, how do we I think there was some really helpful ways that some of the concerns were allayed with Saudi Arabia. So how do we learn some lessons from other challenging chairs and players that we can apply to the US moving forward next 2 years? So not small challenges, but I'd love to hear from our speakers. Just what are you thinking about? How can we start preparing right now to address all of these challenges to make sure that CSW moving forward is as powerful as it has been historically? We can leverage this year on the WPS agenda and moving forward, and make sure that we're centering, the voices that matter, our local stakeholders in this work moving forward. So thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Megan, and really great sort of prompt and food for thought too. But I see Lily, you've raised your hand, so I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, just in thinking about some of the points that Megan made, particularly around the WPS agenda, which is also commemorating an important anniversary this year. I think one of the reasons why the work, particularly within the peace and security agenda, is so siloed is like the high level of expertise that kind of the UN necessitates to be able to participate in these conversations. And I think sometimes that excludes, as Megan rightly said, the everyday work that a lot of individuals are doing, particularly women peace builders, in ways that are sometimes not categorized or that properly fit into what is defined as peace building. So I'm going to put out a plug here amongst this group just to share some of the work that NGO CSW is doing in this area, particularly around the Peace and Gender Equality Working Group. This is an effort of NGO CSW to acknowledge the work that women, amongst other individuals, are doing to build a culture of peace within their communities that maybe is not always that doesn't always fit squarely within the WPS space, which I think over time has become highly securitized, and maybe I think that's why we also don't see it centered as much in the CSW space. But I think a lot of the work that most people who do when they come to CSW can be defined as work that is ultimately trying to create more peaceful societies. So the primary advocacy goal of the group is really to see how to raise awareness of one of the areas of critical concern, which is women in conflict, how women are uniquely affected by conflict, but then also, of course, to see how women in the public and private sphere are working to build peaceful communities. So I think this is an area that is of interest. If people are doing work in this area, we would be very happy to work with you, invite you to join the working group. We had an event during CSW that was really unique. I think we invited individuals to come and give testimonials of their experiences. And many individuals were coming from conflict-affected places and sharing experiences that they had as women coming from these areas. The event was co-hosted with Oxfam. So we'll be happy to have other partners join us and to explore. The women in conflict critical area of concern has not been addressed by CSW in the past 26 years. Because I think we have the WPS agenda. So I think it's one of those examples that Ishan mentioned where if we're talking about one thing in another UN space, it's not addressed in another, whereas actually they're all very much interconnected. So happy to speak about that and share more information. I see that Ivy has put the link in the chat. So thank you so much, Ivy. Thank you, Elena.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lily. Any of our other panelists would you like to jump in on this question Megan's posed?
Maybe I can quickly jump in and just add that this siloed way of working within the UN institutions is a big challenge in many areas of work. So by no design, mostly during CSW, you find that representation of member states from the capital is primarily the national gender machineries. So most delegations will be led by the head of the national gender machinery. And then during the high-level week of the UN General Assembly, it's mostly heads of governments, but also at the ministerial level, it's ministers of foreign affairs. So most of the time, they're the ones who are leading delegations. And then when it comes to WPS specific kind of discussions, we have October that is kind of dedicated to the WPS week, where a different type constellation of delegations come from capital. So I think the idea that Ishan mentioned of trying to find a strategy of building connecting threads across these parts of governments at the national level, working across sectors, and then bringing that up to the international level, that might be one efficient way of working to try and build those bridges. Because I am here representing UN Women, I want to just touch a little bit on the funding crisis. Yes, the UN has always had a liquidity crisis since I joined more than 10 years ago, and we are still having a liquidity crisis, but now it's affected us, the entire UN system, not just UN Women, and our mandate, which is being challenged clearly. And, you know, we are taking some measures as an institution, as an organization. There's a bit of restructuring, and it's not just UN Women, it's many of our sister agencies across the UN system, as a way to try and navigate the funding and, you know, the funding crisis that we are having right now. But the other opportunity that lies here is, you know, looking more into, I'm not sure to what extent the UN system can do this, but for, you know, like civil society and other partners that are part of this call, is kind of turning a little bit more into the non-traditional donors. We have seen in the recent past, let's say during as the momentum of feminist foreign policy has been growing, we have seen the increasingly philanthropic organizations coming forward and, you know, funding civil society and other partners to advance the work that they do. But just to say that we are taking some institutional restructuring in terms of responding to the funding crisis.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I think your insight also from an institutional perspective is really, really helpful. We have a few minutes left. I know I'm going to turn quickly to Gabriella. I know she has to hop off, and then I'll pass it over to Ishan, and then I'll wrap us up.
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, just quickly to answer a little bit on the funding question, because we've certainly seen that for the campaign as well. You know, when we started out, we had a very different plan of how we would work, which we have had to adapt now a number of times because of the lack of funding from the usual donors. And that has certainly also kind of made our work in the Global South have to adjust. But luckily in the Global South, we're very used to that. You know, we have to adjust basically on a daily basis on everything. So that wasn't really a problem. I think in that sense, it might be, you know, harder for civil society organizations who are used to a certain stability. You know, that is not to say that what has happened to USAID and all that is not affecting organizations. It is for sure. But there is a certain resilience and adaptability that luckily kicks in immediately. And that is what we're working on with these organizations that I mentioned that we're working on the national level. We're doing what we can with what we have while we are still looking into funding. And we're also definitely talking about, you know, within the campaign and the steering committee, looking into different kind of funding from countries that usually you wouldn't go to, you know, or that in the past weren't necessarily those that you would turn to. But there are definitely new, yeah, the funding scene is going to change for everyone. I guess that's what I'm going to say. But yeah, there has been a lot of adapting throughout the times of the campaign, and but even with that, it's working really well, luckily. So yeah, thank you also for everything.
Great, thank you so much, Gabriella. And if thanks again if you have to hop off before I can officially say so. But yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Thanks so much. I'll just respond to the last question you put on the chat, which is also about the funding as well. Um, right now, we're having the fourth PrepCom ahead of the fourth Financing for Development conference. And yesterday, UN Women with the Economic Injustice and Rights Action Coalition, as part of Generation Equality, convened a side event on feminist financing. And the member states there who are present, including Tanzania, Spain, Mexico, the UK, and also the Gates Foundation, the World Bank. I mean, one of the things that they were saying is that we need to look at how do we diversify financing and how do we look at innovative means of financing to fill this gap that we're facing. If you look at the liquidity crisis, if you look at UN 80 as well, which is shrouded in this mysterious fog, no one knows what it actually means. But I mean, how do we make sure that we're diversifying funding and engaging the private sector in a manner that fills this funding gap that we're facing, so that we can sustain our advocacy and, in fact, strengthen at a time where it needs to be strengthened? I don't have the answers as to how we do that, but I think that warrants another call on how do we actually strategically engage the private sector? How do we diversify this funding, particularly at these upcoming multilateral gatherings, to really strengthen these linkages between SDG5 and SDG16, and really would welcome another space in which we can have a really focused discussion on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think, yeah, not necessarily fair for us to pose some of these really big questions with only 5 minutes left. But I think the sense that I'm hearing across our panelists, but then, even getting a sense for the comments in the chat as we've had this conversation, there's a lot of interest in continuing to hold space together, looking at the intersections where our communities of practice really overlap and the ways in which we can be working across not just maybe one specific policy area, but a variety of different areas, whether it is financing for development, looking at, gender responsive budgeting and or debt justice, tax justice, civil funding for local civil society organizations. We know, many of them are women and youth-led organizations. But we're also looking at, CSW itself as a mechanism, its links to CEDAW, its links generally to work that member states are doing around gender responsive foreign policy, but also, thinking about the General Assembly and the many high-level meetings we have coming up. We also have the World Social Summit. We didn't even necessarily get into talking about that as well, but we also have this SG selection process coming up. So there are so many opportunities on the calendar ahead, that it's quite important and relevant that we are thinking about these intersections. And I think there are so many existential issues that we are facing right now as civil society working in, international affairs, whether it is peace building and conflict prevention or sustainable development. There are so many existential issues that we're facing, whether it is the funding crisis or, anti-gender, anti-rights narratives and shrinking civic space. There's a real need for organizations that can kind of stick their necks out to speak up and speak out, to start doing and engaging in some of that work, and pushing for and advocating for these issues to really be named and not just sort of hidden in the or murmured in maybe the back of conference rooms while we're sort of treating things as business as usual, because it isn't business as usual to your point, Megan. But that also doesn't mean that we shouldn't be kind of continuing to push ahead, to hold the line, to fight for the hard-earned gains that we've made over these years. And I think at the heart of a lot of this is this idea of narratives and how can we weave together joint narratives that really enshrine the solidarity between our communities and uplift all of the work that we might be doing in our individual organizations, in our individual SDG silos, perhaps, and to really do that in a way that's mutually beneficial and is pushing forward progress across our work. So among those things, one thing I'll maybe plug is that we, along with some other partner organizations like the Alliance for Peacebuilding and Civil Society Platform for Peacebuilding and State Building and Forest International, have a SDG16 storytelling initiative where we are featuring stories of civil society organizations that are working to advance SDG16 related work. And meeting and rising to some of the challenges that we've kind of named as well. So if you all have interest in that, we'll share some more information about that after this call. But oh, and thanks, Nick has dropped a link in the chat on the initiative. Thank you, Nick. But we'll share more information after this conversation, and we'll also stay in touch. I think there's some real opportunities together for us to continue these conversations. And I just want to say one final big thank you to our panelists that are still with us. I know Gabriella had to hop off, but thank you so much again, Lily, Diana, and Ishan and Megan as well for your discussant remarks as well. So thank you all so much. This is our time. I'm now 5 minutes over what we had initially planned for, but I can hang on for just a few minutes, Heiner, if you had a specific question for me, maybe. But yes, thank you all so much again. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks again to all of our panelists for your great comments. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.